Hi, I'm Linda Mal, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and speak with curator Allison Papas about the exhibition Roman Vishniac Rediscovered. Now for Art This Week.
So thanks for joining me today at Roman Vishniac's exhibition that you curated here. It's a pleasure to have you sitting with us today.
Thank you for joining us in Houston.
Well, I was going to start with a general question
Yes.
Around how the exhibition, both in New York and here, came about. I know that in the archives there's about 50,000 objects, 10,000 negatives, and it's a 60-year career. It's not just around the pre-war, post-war area. And there's actually colour photography in the 50s and 70s, and then the microscopy, if that's the right way to say it, work as well in Vishniac's kind of back catalogue. How did the work actually get to a point where it was out here for everybody to see?
The exhibition and also the fact that the archive is actually now held at the International Center of Photography in New York all came together through the diligent work of a curator named Maya Benson, who's at the ICP, who spent about 10 years, possibly longer, working on Vishniac's life, working with his daughter Mara Vishniac-Cohn to work through the materials in the archive and sort of assess what was actually held there, because a lot of the work on display in the exhibition, as well as the work that wasn't selected for the exhibition, much of it has never been really seen before by anybody outside the family. So Maya spent years going through all of the materials and making a full sort of representation of what his life and work was really amounted to, so that they could then select the works that they wanted to exhibit.
And the works, am I right, have all been digitized, and you can see them on an interactive
Yes.
website where you can actually potentially find out or give a name to someone that nobody has known.
And place
about.
names as well. It's helping to identify locations and individuals.
We have the photograph of Hannah Stern, whose tattoo is visible in one of the images. Are there a lot of stories like that in the show actually here of the identified?
There are a number, and the exhibition texts actually indicate when there are individuals who have been identified, and when possible tells the story of what happened to them after the war. So there are certainly a number of individuals, both from the photographs taken in Eastern Europe as well as from some of the photographs behind us from the Netherlands, where we're able to give a little bit more information about who these people were and the lives that they went on to live afterwards.
And Vishniac documented, like a social documentary, the lives of a lot of Jewish people across Europe, not just in Germany. But he was actually a Russian-born citizen, moved to Berlin in the 1920s with his Latvian wife, and then they later moved to the US.
Yes.
How was his life starting off in Russia? And is there any discussion? Does he ever discuss why he became a photographer?
So Vishniac was born to an affluent family living in, he grew up in Moscow. He was born just outside of St. Petersburg. And he actually, as a 7-year-old, was given both a microscope and a camera for his birthday. And so his interests, his sort of dual passions throughout his life in both photography and in the study of the natural world really began to develop as a small child. And he studied biology, chemistry, and zoology, at first in Russia before immigrating to Germany, and then again once he'd arrived in the United States and was able to focus further on his education.
So that birthday present actually really did put him down the direction of photography and microbiology.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
then there's obviously the overlap and his interest in animals and the imprisonment of how the imprisonment of animals in zoos, how
Sure.
we treat animals, and then also how the Jewish community were treated in a very tragic and similar conditions as zoos. There is a picture actually in the exhibition of a polar bear taken from behind, looking through the cage out at the public. Can you tell us about that photograph?
In the 20s, Vishniac began making street photographs around Berlin. Photography in Germany in the 20s was enormously popular, and there were lots of camera clubs all over the country, and it was fairly common for people to begin out as amateurs and end up becoming increasingly interested in making photographs and to develop their talent in that way. And Vishniac falls into that sort of trajectory. Most of his early photographs from the 20s in Berlin, which we have a number of in the exhibition, are these street photographs where he's sort of moving through the city, beginning to find his place in it as a recent sort of expatriate in the city. And he has this sort of a very keen eye for both the sort of humor in odd moments that happen in a bustling cosmopolitan city, and also for the sort of slightly ominous signs that began to creep in as the Nazi rise to power began to change policy in the city. And so his photographs sort of play back and forth between the modernist movement that he was aware of as it was developing around him. He had a very keen sense of composition and experimented with sort of striking avant-garde compositions that were the hallmark of Weimar photography. But then the subject matter, he kind of slips back and forth into these very telling images, like the photograph of the polar bears.
So it's the possibility of satire, but the sinister and the kind of playfulness, but also the ominous.
Exactly.
That I guess we could read a lot more into since history's played itself out in such a tragic way. But even at that point, he's quite ready to see that. I know that when Hitler was starting to become more kind of prevalent and powerful, he would put Maya, his daughter, in front of posters so that he could photograph the posters. But if anybody asked him what he was doing, then he could say, oh no, I'm just photographing my daughter. So he was also kind of documenting that sinister step by step.
Right. I think as Vishniac became aware of the increasingly restrictive policy, and actually in 1933 the Editorial Act was passed, which meant that anybody working in the publishing industry, which included photographers, had to be able to provide proof of Aryan heritage. And then I think it was in 1934 it actually became illegal for Jews to take photographs on the street. So the fact that Vishniac continued to take these pictures, which he did throughout the 30s, really shows the importance that he attributed to documenting what was happening and sort of trying to show the visible signs of how the world was beginning to change.
I mean, we've talked about that kind of the beginning of the pre-war, but the very close to that rise. He actually leaves with his family in 1938. His children go to Sweden. He goes to the Netherlands, and then France, Portugal, and then they go to the US. But he's still very connected to what's happening. How does his work shift as he starts moving out of Germany?
Vishniac actually worked in a variety of styles throughout his career, and that's something that we see with his developing modernist eye in the 20s, but then he's able in different moments to draw on the styles that are developing in the photography world broadly around him throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s. And so the exhibition includes some of the early modernist work. It includes his social documentary photographs from Eastern Europe. The photographs behind us that were taken in the Netherlands were also the result of one of his commissions from the JDC. So while they had a sort of documentary assignment behind them, he chose to work in a very different style that reflected the context that he was within. The photographs that he was taking at this agrarian training school in the Netherlands are very reminiscent of a Russian constructivist style, where he's shooting from a low vantage point and using a very strong internal geometry to the compositions of the images in order to sort of enhance this sense of strong, youthful energy and vigor with these sort of heroic young men and women who are training themselves for a better future. So he's marrying the style of composition and the sort of artistic style that he was aware of from being familiar with Russian avant-garde movements to the context of the documentary project that he was working on.
Mostly throughout his life he's shooting with a Leica and a Rolleiflex.
Correct.
The Leica with 35mm film and the Rolleiflex with 120 film. And then he hand prints his own work with gelatin silver or platinum printing methods. How does he have access to film and printing when like that just before the war starts? And how does he save his negatives? I mean, 10,000 negatives get out of the country.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, is that all he's carrying, or does he send them with the children to Sweden? Or?
So, separating the two different parts of the question.
So many questions.
Fine. when he was in Berlin, he set up a makeshift studio in his bathroom, so he was printing at home early on. In regards to his negatives, while he was in Paris in 1939, shortly before immigrating to the United States, he actually left all of his negatives in the care of a good friend of his named Walter Beerer. And it was shortly after that that Vishniac was imprisoned in a French internment camp for about a month before then being released and ultimately immigrating with his family. And the negatives ended up in New York a little while later via a trip to Cuba with Walter Beerer, but they made it successfully back into Vishniac's hands. They were, in many instances, cut up, though, in order to be more portable. Not the individual image frames, but cut apart from the rolls of film, so that part of the work that Maya and her team have been doing as they're sort of making their way through the archive is to go back and re-identify the images that negatives were taken in, and the ways in which when he sort of went to this city and then moved on to that city, and reconstructing his journey and path.
So when he wrote about his work, or when he's been quoted, especially in the book, it's mentioned that he has said, if I can't save lives, I can at least save memories. And this in some way shows how he's potentially interacting with the people that he's documenting, maybe the objectives, the reasons, his goals of why he continues to shoot. I was wondering if you could tell me about how it's impacted on a present day audience, also on the survivors, that I guess people are starting to be of the age where there's less survivors now, but over the time when these photographs started to come out, and also how it maybe had an impact on the United States and the president, as far as the fact that he was able to show these images why the war was still going on.
Vishniac's photographs of Eastern Europe, which were taken over about a 4-year period from 1935 to 38, have had a number of different contexts and thus interpretations over time. Photographs are very nimble artworks, and depending on the context from which they're seen, their meaning really does change. So when Vishniac first made the photographs, he actually went to Eastern Europe on a number of trips that were the result of commissions from the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And at the time, when the JDC was sending him out to take these photographs, they were hoping to have images that sort of focused on the poverty of the lifestyle that they could then use in order to help with fundraising efforts to be able to send relief back and set up summer camps to get children out of sort of basement dwellings in Warsaw in the summer and into more healthy environments. And they had a number of different elements to their mission, but the photographs were really directed towards helping them reach audiences in Western Europe and in the United States. So from the beginning, the photographs were actually really directed towards an American audience in large part. Very quickly, though, as history rapidly unfolded, the context of the images began to change, and they shifted from being a plea for aid towards becoming sort of this record of a world that was disappearing before people's eyes. So when the photographs were first sort of exhibited in the United States beginning in the early 40s and entered publications more broadly than the JDC's original uses for them, it was happening at a moment in which this transition was beginning to happen, and people were realizing that the carnage was happening at a speed that wasn't going to be stopped, and that essentially these photographs were the last visual record of a world that was in the process of being exterminated, annihilated. And so it's common for photographs' context to change, but it's fascinating in this particular instance that moment of history happened so quickly, and that the photographs took on this entirely new meaning. And subsequently, they've actually, because they are the largest body of work representing life in Eastern Europe in between the two world wars, they have become probably the most impactful group of photographs in determining the way that we envision this world when we think back to what it looks like. What's then interesting is that those photographs have helped to create this sense of what that world looked like. And to a certain degree, the fact that they were really focusing on a certain aspect of that life, and that there were other images that were also taken and which weren't published at the time and didn't become a part of the collective visual memory, it all sort of adds up to this interesting instance where the sense of this world that we have is a more limited one than the world actually was. Life in Eastern Europe was actually much more diverse and sort of
a rich tapestry.
Yeah, I mean there was so much activity and diversity happening that Vishniac documented, but which the JDC and sort of the subsequent publications didn't really end up showing. So the exhibition shows this full context and really changes the way that we've looked at his Eastern European photographs by opening up these new perspectives on the broader, richer life that he was documenting.
So one of the goals is to redress that balance so that it's not just a series of very kind of specific slices of history
Absolutely.
And expectations on what the conditions were.
And then also putting those 4 years worth of photographs in the context of his 60-year career, which again changes the way that we look at them and understand his interests and passions throughout his life and sort of how he used his photographs to explore the world around him.
So I know that Vishniac's work not only having an impact in the States and later on through editorial and for the survivors now, but even at that very moment when people were needing to get out of the country, he managed to photograph certain children who then those images were taken out and families decided to adopt them. For example, Nettie Stubb, who was adopted by a Swedish family. Can you tell me about that case?
Nettie Stubb said she found the photograph of her that Vishniac had taken in a publication and actually reached out to the family and said that she thought that she had been saved because of Vishniac's photograph, that she really credited sort of the visibility that Vishniac brought to what was happening to children like her to being a large part of the reason that they ultimately were able to be saved.
So as we start to wrap up the interview, I thought maybe you could take us through a few choice images that come to mind that have stories or very specific contrasts that you'd like to mention.
There's a group of photographs in the Room of Photographs from Eastern Europe that focus on basement dwellings in Warsaw, where large numbers of families would be living together in close quarters. And in the particular grouping that we have, there's a photograph to the right of a young girl named Sarah that is one of Vishniac's most iconic photographs. It's in all of the publications. If you know one photograph by Vishniac, it's likely the one that you know. And it was used, in the letterhead for a fundraising campaign by the JDC. So it's really one of the prime examples of the types of social documentary photographs that Vishniac was trying to make on his assignment for the JDC, images that would pull at the heartstrings and that had this strong sense of a personal narrative and a story. And in fact, he sort of embellished the historical story a little bit to enhance that sense of the dire circumstances of these children who were stuck in basements all winter because they didn't have shoes and it was too cold to get out of bed. And there's this great degree of pathos in the photograph and this girl with incredibly serious eyes staring out at Vishniac. But the grouping also includes a photograph of a young boy in a basement dwelling with kindling behind him. And that composition, while of a very similar subject, it's also another child who's living in a basement dwelling and sort of is in need of the type of relief that the JDC can offer. This photograph is almost entirely about the composition, and we see Vishniac's modernist eye is still strong and still coming through no matter where he is and what subjects he's focusing on. But it's an extraordinary composition where the boy is sort of jutted out into this contrast with the sharp pieces of wood behind him and this division of the architectural structure around them. And it's a great way to look at sort of all of these different components of Vishniac and his eye and his interests and who he was, balancing each other out throughout different stages of his career.
So he arrives at both social documentary and a kind of a really developed aesthetic.
Absolutely.
Which is exciting to actually still have that creative side even when you're confronted with these very difficult...
Which the best documentary photographers always maintain that balance in their work, I think.
And I think before we end the interview, we should discuss the fact that he was also working with microscopy and how his marriage of microbiology was going into his knowledge and act with the camera.
For the last 45 years of his career, Vishniac really focused on his scientific work, making color and black and white slides at the microscopic level of organisms. And what's extraordinary for those of us who are familiar with Vishniac as a social documentary photographer is to realize that in a field that is so incredibly different, he was every bit as much of an innovator and a key figure, and that he actually was responsible for dozens of magazine covers. He was on the cover of Life. He was published in all of the major science journals at the time. And he had these two incredibly different and yet interrelated interests that really, since he was a child, since he was 7, he sort of fell in love with these different worlds. And it's exciting to be able to marry the sort of photographs for which he might be better known to our museum audiences, alongside the work that was also a major passion of his throughout his life and which he really dedicated himself to.
And the marriage of art and science is often actually, I mean, it's becoming more known of, but it's relatively less seen in a museum or art gallery.
And he had degrees in both biology and art education, which when he went back to higher education once he'd arrived in the United States. And he was a professor, and he really spent his life marrying those two passions of his. So it's great to be able to include that in the exhibition and show people, with our Houston audiences, his extraordinary eye, no matter what the context or style that he was working in.
So thank you so much for coming and talking to us today.
It's my pleasure.
Appreciated
Thank you.
it.
We want to thank Allison for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to mfah.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.